Hello, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that little video. My name's Alison Symington, and I am chair of the Breakfast Committee, a great volunteer organization that tries to come up with great speakers for these breakfasts, and also sit on the board of LSO. And today we're going to talk about biomanufacturing and exploring the biomanufacturing sector, which is something very close to my heart. I was telling some of the speakers before that I used to be in this sector specifically, used to work on vaccine development. So I'm quite excited to hear what's been going on. And also it's been a topic of much discussion, I think, for many of us over this last year, where we are with the biomanufacturing sector and what we can do with increasing it in Canada. So we've got a great lineup of speakers for you today, and I don't want to spend too much time talking because they're the ones you want to hear from. There is a Q&A, and I'll moderate the Q&A. So if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A session, which is off on my screen anyway, off to the right of my screen. So our first speaker today, oh, somebody can't hear me speaking. Hopefully everybody else can. Today, the first speaker today is Dr. Paul Hodgson from Veto. Paul joined the Veto senior management team in 2006, and he's responsible for business development, for marketing and communications within the organization. And in addition to that role, he's a founding director of the provincial vaccine enterprise called Prevent, which is a national centre of excellence in commercialization and research, and also a member of Canada's Vaccine Industry Committee. So we're very pleased to have Paul, and we thank him greatly because he's up early today because he's coming to us from Saskatchewan. So I'm going to introduce Paul to come to the stage.
Thank you very much, Alison, and thanks to Life Science Ontario for inviting me to do this. What I thought I'd do today is, because many of the audience might not be familiar with some of the more intimate details of the organization, is I'm going to give a background to the organization, talk about some of our new initiatives, one of which is the Biomanufacturing Initiatives, and then just give a few closing thoughts. And I've titled this Veto 2.0. For those of you that are familiar with the organization, you'll see some of the transitions as I go through. And I'm just going to start a timer here so I make sure that I try not to go over time. Next slide. So the organization is about 45 years old. It's part of the University of Saskatchewan, but our governance model is a little bit different because we have a separate board. We have about 160 personnel from 25 countries, and equity, diversity, inclusion seems to be a lot of the new priorities right now. So I thought I'd say about 55% of our personnel are female, about 35% visible minorities. And what I say is, with people from 25 countries, Christmas potlucks are pretty interesting. The organization operates on I'll call it soft money. We have no fixed money over a long term, but it is one of the world-class containment infrastructure. It's one of the biggest containment facilities in the world, and currently right now we'd have about $250 million in infrastructure, and I'll describe that a little bit later. Pre-pandemic, we were doing about 150 vaccine infectious disease animal studies annually. Most of that's in our containment level 2 facility because the containment level 3 ag facility was just coming up and running. The specialty of the organization is really large or alternative animal models of disease. And that's, I'll talk about a capacity aspect of that when you build a facility for large animal models of disease, and for something like COVID, where the model that seems to be chosen is a Syrian hamster, what that does to what we never thought of from capacity challenges. We've commercialized 8 vaccines over the course of our life. 6 of those are described as world first. There's 2 more currently in the commercial pathway. And interestingly, our first vaccine, I've tried to put a picture up there, was Vicodin. It was a vaccine for calf scours. A lot of those vaccines are livestock vaccines. And this vaccine was a collaboration or partnership between Veto and the VI in Vicodin and Connaught Labs at the time, the CO. So it was an interesting collaboration way back when between Ontario and Saskatchewan. And we've had 4 spin-off companies over time, and the most recent one of those was Prevent, that was Alison was kind enough to mention. Next slide, please. So this is, I won't go into it too much, but this is the containment facility. It is one of the top 3 in the world right now. It's about 2.5 football fields in size. It's significant large animal capacity, but again, Syrian hamster. So when we're working with the Gates Foundation or CEPI, a lot of the questions have been, and the government of Canada, what's your capacity? And I say, well, we can do about 500,000 hamsters a year if you really wanted to. That's the size of the facility, but we didn't have the manpower to actually do that because we were really just finishing our ramp up mode when this pandemic hit. And one of the learning experiences over this is that training people to work in level 3 takes significantly more time than you think. And as soon as you're training someone, you've lost that body to actually do research. So it was a balance we were trying to reach. One of the newest things we have going on is in-house GMP vaccine manufacturing. And this is a national facility that happens to be in Saskatoon. It's accessible to all scientists around the world, but because it's funded through CFI-MSI, Canadian academic scientists get an incredibly preferential rate for accessing this. And some of the pictures on the bottom, you can see we've had bison in the facility, we've had bats in the facility. And one of the ones I like the most is we were working with MERS prior to the pandemic being started, another coronavirus. We can't get camels easily in Canada, but we do have an alpaca, which is a camelid family. So we developed a model of MERS in alpacas and developed a vaccine there. Next slide, please. I won't go into this too much. I think it just, because we have one of the only facilities that was able to handle the virus in Canada, we made a great contribution overall. We've worked with over 100 different companies and collaborators doing this, and we worked with Sunnybrook to actually isolate the virus that we're using in-house and have given back to NML to transmit. Next slide. So just a couple of pictures of our scientists working in level 3 for those of you that aren't familiar with the PAPRs. So we have high HEPA filters on the back, and they're inside one of the 6 containment labs we have. We also have 18 animal rooms to support the containment labs. And this has been pretty much nonstop for the last year and a half with incredibly long days for the staff. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that people are getting saturated at this point. And we're all hoping, scientists, non-scientists, and community, for this pandemic to end sooner rather than later. Next slide. So this is the Ferret model, because Ferret was really the SARS, what worked with the original SARS is the model we developed first. So we were working with the animal care staff. So we have 5 clinical veterinarians and about 15 animal care staff on site to develop this model with our scientists, but it's been surpassed by the Syrian hamster model. Next slide. So one of the things we were looking at ourselves for strategic planning, et cetera, is how we can expand the organization's capabilities and capacities to better partner and serve the research community. And the tagline we put around that is a National Center for Pandemic Research. The board actually didn't like the word pandemic because it was very specific and they wanted emerging infectious diseases, but it's, you know, this audience gets what the goal of that is. So as part of that, we've actually received significant funding from the Government of Canada and the Government of Saskatchewan to upgrade our animal housing, and as well as key areas of our CL3 Ag to containment level 4. So this would make our facility the only containment level, non-government containment level 4 facility in Canada. And the reason we're able to do that is essentially a containment level 3 Ag facility. You could also think of it as containment level 3 plus, is areas, our aerobiology area is already built to level 4 standards. So this is really going to expand our capacity to work with any pathogen worldwide in the facility, of course, governed by the regulatory agencies. And the last part of that is establishing a vaccine development and manufacturing center, which is the key to this talk. Next slide. And the goal of this facility, and this has been a long time in the making, and I'll talk about that a little bit, was really to combine scientific expertise and with technological capabilities, and really, in all honesty, help drive innovation in Canada to commercial development. So this facility is not really a big commercial manufacturing facility. It will have emergency preparedness, but you could think of it more as a large-scale, pilot-scale manufacturing with GMP. And this is, again, it's part of a national facility that's funded by CFI-MSI, the government of Saskatchewan. So this is open to Canadian academics to access at subsidized rates. And it's really for Veto's internal technologies a way that we're switching to more of a stage gate approach to bridge the gap between discovery, so our discovery research, and really driving commercialization of our technology. So I would call it much more applied research. And it's a mindset Veto had early on. Veto did make vaccines through a spin-off company, but this is really coming back to that, to really ensure that the discoveries we're making go through the full gamut to the benefit of society. Next slide. And this diagram is basically where we are. So Veto right now would probably be tech readiness level 4, which is sort of prototype development, maybe some original proof of concept in animals. And depending on whether this is an animal or human vaccine, we can go really from tech readiness level 6 to tech readiness level 8. And this is really based on a US model. Canada always seems to have to be different, so we call it in Canada solution readiness levels. We couldn't call it biosafety levels, we call it containment levels, but it's basically the same. It overlaps with the Canadian pathway. Next slide. So what I wanted to do with this slide is say this has been, at least for the manufacturing, a long time coming. And I always remember hearing that Einstein had a definition of insanity of doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. So in all honesty, I did the same thing over and over and finally got a different result, because I knew that Canada didn't have manufacturing capacity, and hindsight's 20/20 for everyone. But for those of you that have been in the business a while, you know that in 2007 or 8, there was a call for proposals in the Canadian HIV vaccine initiative to build a level 3 manufacturing facility to develop HIV vaccines at the same time using excess capacity to do other vaccines. And the government of Canada and the Gates at the time canceled this because the statement was that the world had excess capacity for vaccine production and this wasn't needed. I guess they would take that statement back right now based on what we're doing. Then we said this is still needed, even though this funding was canceled. Let's look at different opportunities. So we started to continue discussions with government shortly after that. We were dealing with commercial interest with various large-scale partners because of the ability of where we could put this and some of the process development, which is more limited in the big companies. So I put a funding application December 2013. It was ranked on standing but declined. We redid a market assessment in 2015, came back, yes, this was still needed. So we resubmitted that funding application in 2015. It was ranked outstanding, but declined. Made some trips to Ottawa to try and convince the politicians and the bureaucrats that this was valuable. At the same time, NRC did a cross-Canada biomanufacturing strategy in 2016, and the conclusion came that Canada needed biomanufacturing. I resubmitted the application in 2017, and this is to a federal government granting agency. So ultimately it can be reviewed, but it's up to the ministerial decision, just for those of you that aren't familiar with the approach. They thought it was too much money at the time, so we're asked to resubmit it as a 2-stage approach. We did one as a veterinary stage and 2 as a human stage. And I was happy to say in 2018, the veterinary stage was funded, and during the pandemic, they fully funded the operations of the facility. So it was a great success story. It just took a lot longer than we had thought. Next slide. So this facility is a GMP manufacturing. For humans, it's really going to be focused on more phase 1, phase 2 biologics. It will be able to do full commercial production of veterinary biologics. For those of you interested in the size, this is the largest capacity. There's obviously a turn down aspect of that, but it's 1,000-liter bacterial cell culture production, as well as a 500-meter squared adherent cell culture production. And a fill finish suite size to meet the manufacturing. So it's not going to be a big fill finish site. And it's an area I think that has received, other fill finish sites have received some investment in Canada. And the construction is going to be completed this year, and we'll start the regulatory GMP certification process. I say it'll be done in 2022, but really that's out of our hands. So we're working with the regulators right now. And we've got companies coming in as founding partners. We're still recruiting those, but several probably that are on this call have come in as founding partners to invest in the facility. It is not incorporated, so there's no shares, but we do subsidized access to the facility to the founding partners. Next slide. I won't stay on this slide, but this is sort of a schematic layout or the floor plan of what is going to happen. This is in a limited space. So this took multiple iterations to have this done in an area that was not only fit the space, but was still productive. Next slide. So some of the kudos to ourselves actually, because it's a pretty ambitious project. And this hopefully is still relatively accurate, but we know there's been a lot of manufacturing capacity being built. The only GMP, this facility will actually be able to produce under biosafety level 3. So it's the only GMP BSL-3 manufacturing facility in Canada, reportedly the 4th in North America, 5th in the world. Again, it's phase 1, phase 2 material, part of the national emergency response. So in the event there's a national emergency, something like this, it could actually produce for larger scale human clinical production. It's the first veterinary vaccine facility in North America for different product types in the same footprint. So it was been a regulatory challenge there, and it will be able to do foreign animal disease. Again, I want to reiterate to the people here, because I think a lot of you guys are in Ontario, my birthplace. It's a national facility that happens to be in Saskatoon, and it's here for priority for Canadian use. Next slide. So this is the conclusion slide. This is not my statement about the process and the timelines to do this. This is not about trying to penalize any government. This went across governments, but hindsight's 2020. So I think what we focus on now is a positive. Canada recognizes weakness in national biomanufacturing capacity and have made some investments. And when I give talks, I say we have some fantastic companies in Canada, some of which are on this call, but they were making other vaccines, and changing complicated processes is not the easiest task. So I think some of that's is being dealt with. The government has made significant investments to promote capacity as part of a $1 billion plan to mobilize. Veto has been a recipient of a large amount of that money, but I also just pulled a few others. So NRC, Sanofi, Abcellera, Medicago, Abcellera. I got Abcellera twice, my apologies, and we even have the fill finish side of it too, getting investments. So they've looked at the whole pipeline of what was missing. I think one of the things everyone's going to have to think about for the non-big companies is worldwide investment in these biomanufacturing facilities is increasing, and how do we ensure sustainable operations for these after the pandemic? And the other one I talk about is that I want to be very clear that national vaccine preparedness is very different than vaccine nationalism. And I think if we do this right, Canada's facilities will contribute to worldwide capacity to help stop the next infectious disease threat. And I think that's to the benefit of the world. And then I think lastly, Veto, the next Veto, iteration of Veto, which is changing from strictly veterinary from 1945 to a much more integrated zoonotic One Health aspect, will be completely integrated for emerging infectious diseases and partnership and collaboration. I think that's all. Next slide. And that's my contact information. For anybody that wishes to reach out, I would just ask anyone that does reach out for a little bit of patience. We're still being inundated with requests for COVID research, so I'm responding a little bit slower than I'd hoped to. Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm about 40 seconds over.
Oh, no, Paul, that's fabulous. So I do have a question, and again, as you said, hindsight's 2020, but you know, if you had got that manufacturing money earlier, you know, in some of the early reiterations of your proposals, how do you think it might have changed performance, Canada's performance on the COVID vaccine development stage? What would have been?
So Canada has a few companies, and I'll name the ones that I've worked with. So Biodextrous we worked with has been a fantastic partner. Resilient, Therapeutics, which is now Resilience, was a good partner for us. But for our own vaccine, for our own vaccine, our director figures, our vaccine would have been 6 months earlier. And we are developing a COVID subunit vaccine, which doesn't sound like much. But as the vaccinations rolled out, it's been interesting to watch the regulatory challenges of performing clinical trials, because when there's a regulatory approved vaccine and you're trying to do a clinical trial with your own vaccine, and you're doing this with, we work with the Canadian Centre for Vaccinology, which is public, fantastic partner. But the physician giving the vaccine, because their duty is to the patient, has to advise the patients that they shouldn't be participating in this trial. They should be getting the approved vaccine. So by having vaccines that were actually approved, it's become a little bit more complicated, and it would have That 6 months is an absolute timeline of where we would have been faster, but what that's done is it's created lag times and other things. So I think for our own vaccine, it would have been significantly faster, and it would have given greater capacity to help. At the same time, for us, it's really established some partnerships with groups that we hadn't worked with before.
Right. Thanks for that. And one of your slides referred to therapeutics. Can you expand a little bit more on what Veto's doing in that area?
So most of the therapeutics has been for testing other people's therapeutics, but previously we've been involved in a lot of the innate immune stimulators, which is one of the things that several groups have looked at for COVID. If we can generally stimulate the innate immune response, how does that potentially help? But the facility itself is going to be for biologics. So there's nothing stopping the infrastructure from producing monoclonal antibodies. It was currently not producing mRNA vaccines. It's really the vaccines that can be produced in it. We're going to be the inactivated, live attenuated, vector-based, so ChAdOx and some of those, as well as subunit-based vaccines.
Yeah. And I'm just going through some of the questions here, so hopefully, I apologize, they're a bit scattered, but how did you determine who was going to be your manufacturing facility partner? That somebody would like to know, and how you chose them, discovered them, etc.
So we focused on some of Canada's largest for sure, because these are not insignificant investments we're asking for on the human side. And on the veterinary side, we went a little bit, there's not a lot of veterinary vaccine producers in Canada, so we went a little bit wider worldwide. We put a proposal forward to them, and they made a decision on whether to come in or not. So definitely the focus is on Canadian first, and as part of that, don't forget this was pre-pandemic when it started. So this was part of the, here's what we have, here's what we are going to be able to offer when this is done from a process development, clinical trial side, phase 1, phase 2, veterinary vaccine a little bit different. And even at the time, it gathered great interest, and so now it's interesting how it's looking, because there is a lot of these investments right now.
Right. And I think you mentioned to me prior to us coming on this screen that you've done something like 600 media.
So I think we'd be about 650 media interviews right now. We are the focus of 3 or 4 W5. I don't have them on the top of my head, but if you think of the major documentary groups, they've all been within the facility now.
So
which is
maybe it's a last question, and this we could do a whole session on. So maybe we'll have a quick answer, and then we might ask you to come back and talk about it at another time. But someone was wondering about what your thoughts are on best practices, because this is a very complex, complicated topic to talk to people about.
Best practices of what, sorry?
Communicating.
So I'll start, maybe I'll go pre-pandemic, and I apologize for those scientists on the call, including myself as a scientist. But we have not done well at communicating our research to the general public. And as part of that, this is a 12-year process, and it was, for my application, this was ranked outstanding, my Veto application, but didn't pass the ministerial threshold. So what that says to me is we were not doing a job elevating the importance of this to the politicians, because the politicians, Canada's this massive country with almost no taxpayers, in all honesty. So we have a limited number of tax dollars, and if you have healthcare and roads and all these other things fighting for this limited number of taxpayers, the politicians are going to listen to the voters and what's important to them. So I tell everybody that SARS went away relatively quickly. That corporate memory dropped relatively quickly. I'm not maybe because it was only 800 cases. This one, the corporate memory is going to be there a much longer period of time, that we need to be prepared for this, but it will start to wane. So this is really up to us to keep the communication and dialogue going with media of how important it is. And I think if we do that, it's going to relay that to the politicians, that investments in science and research and development are fundamental to not only growing a knowledge-based innovative economy, but fundamental to the health of us, especially in infectious diseases, because we've seen the socioeconomic impact of what one can do. And one of the things I say is this isn't meant to sound morbid, but thank goodness this wasn't a disease that killed a lot of people. This is sort of, they estimate 10 times flu, but I told you we work with MERS when we've developed a model on a vaccine. MERS kills about 33% of the people it infects, not 2%. So imagine what would have happened to worldwide supply chain, travel, true vaccine nationalism at that point if we had something that was killing 1 in 3 people. It would have been, the world would have been an absolute chaos, well beyond what it currently is.
So Paul, thank you very much. I know there are other outstanding questions, so I apologize. Maybe that can be covered sometime in the networking, or reach out to Paul specifically. I'm sure he'd be happy to answer some of the questions. And I think one of the questions was about government funding and engaging. And I think some of the things you said about what you just said about talking to media and communicating, it's exactly the same going to government. So, but thank you very much, Paul, for your work. I'd like to now introduce Michael May, who's the President and CEO for the Center for Commercialization of Regenerative Medicine, or CCRM as we know it, which is a Canadian not-for-profit that develops technologies, launches new companies, and catalyzes investments in the field of regenerative medicine, including cell and gene therapy. And I'll leave it to you, Michael, to discuss more about what you're up to.
Yeah, thanks very much, Allison, and thanks for the invitation to participate today. It's an exciting time for life sciences and biomanufacturing, and great presentation, Paul. You know, I thought I would start by, well, first of all, we're in the area of cell and gene therapy, and cell and gene therapy has become, you know, one of the hottest areas in biotech in terms of investment and development. But we were part of a supercluster several years ago, all focused on biomanufacturing with, I'm sure many of the people who are on this call, and it was a pan-Canadian proposal that was not successful. And, you know, 4 or 5 years ago, we were talking about all the issues that have really become apparent with the COVID pandemic, you know, a supply chain, domestic security of supply chain, and just gaps in manufacturing. And you know, the government, I can say this, I'd like to say this here, the government would have looked brilliant if it had invested in biomanufacturing. You know, it is, you know, and I focus here on some of the investments in Ontario only. We know that investments have been made across Canada in biomanufacturing since the pandemic. And that's wonderful. CCRM, which I'll talk about in a bit, you know, has really embedded manufacturing in its strategy for its entire 10 years. But you know, the investments in Ontario alone are very, very significant and really change the landscape for life sciences. Maybe I'll just throw out right off the bat a couple of observations that maybe we can talk about. You know, one is that there have been a lot of individual investments across the country. And I don't think we see yet, like we were proposing in our supercluster application, kind of ecosystem building or kind of broad collaboration around a biomanufacturing strategy for Canada. And that would be great to see. Because I'm in and has a potential to be where Canada can be a leader. I don't think we've transitioned yet from kind of reacting to the COVID pandemic and starting to look at other areas of biomanufacturing, you know, in support of a kind of a strategy. But, you know, since our supercluster application, cell and gene is leading. Next slide. I just wanted to give you some context for our focus in and raise some of the challenges. So we were launched in 2011, and you know, this slide shows the rationale for the creation of CCRM as a translation center. We compared ourselves in cell and gene therapy to other jurisdictions in the world. You know, academic output as patents per publication kind of ranked us at second. When we looked at how many patents needed to be generated in Canada before someone was brave enough or had the resources company, we fell to the bottom of the pile. And then when we looked at the amount of jobs per company, it showed that most of the companies in Regen Med and cell and gene therapy were virtual, and the activities were offshore, and that companies needed to go down to the US to get the resources to advance their programs and to raise capital. And if you move to the next slide, these stats have changed in the last 5 or 6 years, and we're kind of in the middle of the pack now. But just to give you some context, since 2011, when CCRM was created, the investment in cell and gene therapy has grown significantly. It's still dwarfed by the US, but a number of companies in Canada have raised investments. And some of these, CCRM has played a role in. So access to capital is part of it, but what contributes to our attractiveness for raising capital? And that really is at the foundation of the CCRM. To the next slide, just a little background on CCRM. We've leveraged government investment. We're a public-private partnership, 200 employees, all focused on commercializing cell and gene therapy. In the early days, 90% of our funding came from government, and now only 10% of our funding comes from government. And we're headquartered in downtown Toronto in the Discovery District, but have partners around the world. And if you move to the next slide, just to give you a little bit of a summary of what we do in our business model. Foundational to the CCRM model is the kind of this ecosystem thinking and the launch of key stakeholder consortia. So we started with an academic consortium with access of those institutions, University of Toronto, University Health Network, Sick Kids, the institutes are kind of core members, but we have academic partners across Canada, around the world. On the back of those and the scientists, we built an industry consortium that started at 13 and really grew to now about 120 companies. And those companies really provide market pull to balance the technology push from academia. And then over the last building an investor network, capital is really needed to drive this model. We have 6 teams at CCRM that represent kind of expertise, specialized funding, and specialized infrastructure. There are 3 activities that the teams do. We do proprietary development, so we source IP, evaluate, bundle it into strategic company creations, de-risk those opportunities with academia and industry, really to enhance the deal flow in the ecosystem. The second thing we do, and this is where we have a lot of focus on manufacturing, which I'll talk about, is we provide contract services, gap-filling contract services. And that generates revenue for us. But what it really does is build reputation, allow us to attract opportunities and companies from around the world, but also really builds our capabilities project by project. And those capabilities we then can use to drive the proprietary development and the company creation, so that we're doing that in a very capital efficient manner. And the third thing we do, which is modest right now, but growing, is we act as seed investors to attract investment. And this is at the heart of our sustainability model, where we can reinvest our returns on exit back into CCRM ecosystem. But we typically invest, direct investment, or we are founders in companies, but we also offer our services in exchange for equity as another means to help startup companies. So next slide. When we think of, the grand challenge of creating companies that are sticky in Canada and are sustainable in Canada, we really have 3 pillars to that strategy. First and foremost, over the last 10 years, has been growing a continuum of manufacturing capability. And this has happened in 3 stages in 3 different ways. So we have launched about 6 years ago with GE Healthcare, now Cytiva and U of T, the the Center for Advanced Cell Therapy Technologies, which has anywhere between 35 and 50 employees, that provides a fee-for-service scale-up and automation and process, but also works on several strategic manufacturing technology platform projects to develop in Canada kind of leading edge manufacturing technology and platforms. That initiative or team is seamlessly connected to a clinical phase GMP facility that we operate in partnership with the University Health Network called the Center for Cell and Vector Production, 10 clean dedicated to viral vector production. And that's in the Mars facility in downtown Toronto alongside this CAT-CT that we have. And both of these generate significant revenue on fee-for-service, but as I mentioned, develop technologies as well. And now we are leveraging those activities into a partnership with McMaster Innovation Park and the launch of a for-profit CDMO in cell and gene therapy to build Omnia Bio, which will be launched over several stages over the next few years, ultimately planning for about 350,000 square feet of manufacturing space that will serve both autologous and allogeneic cell therapies with the operating model that will allow hoteling. So just move to the next slide. I think it's important just to focus on our developing manufacturing technology platforms in parallel with offering, manufacturing services. So we've developed best-in-class pluripotent stem cell production and expansion technology, and combine that with reprogramming and gene editing platforms. We have an automated closed CAR-T platform, and that's really the vector. Media optimization platform. We can look at tens of thousands of components simultaneously. Invested a lot in both the upstream and downstream viral vector workflows, a lot of focus on analytics and cryopreservation as well. And we test these platforms in our clinical facility, and the aim would be to, of course, commercial spin-off over time. Next, just a couple more slides, or actually our vision though, back to ecosystem building, is that the Omnia Bio will be on the McMaster Innovation Park campus, an anchor company in a biomanufacturing ecosystem. So, we're taking the phase manufacturing, kind of expanding those capabilities at the McMaster Innovation Park site and building commercial scale capabilities, and then kind of wrapping around Omnia Bio an incubator and logistics and other ecosystem partners to create this ecosystem in kind of cell and gene therapy. We think that ecosystem approach is really, really important. Next slide. Just a couple more slides just to kind of manufacturing is important in the overall strategy. We are, in parallel developing strategic investment. At the very early stage, we incubate companies and invest in kind of modest amounts, and have developed at the later stages kind of deep investor networks. But in the middle there, we launched last December CCRM Enterprises, which is a for-profit investment arm of CCRM, and are working on a cell and gene therapy focused Therapeutics VC fund to fill the gap in the middle. Companies can progress and attract outside investment more easily in the space. And we have a portfolio of companies, have helped 14. The market cap of those companies is in the billions. They've raised about $1 billion. So we think that this model has great traction. And Notch Therapeutics was our most recent success, which did a Series A in February of 105 million Canadian. Next slide. The third area of focus, which I think really needs to be mentioned in the manufacturing sector is talent development. And we, with other partners in cell and gene therapy in Canada here, are doing a lot of training at the interface between industry and academia. And we have a program for our company creation, which is kind of industry facing. But on the academic facing side, we think that there is going to be a huge demand for GMP staff. And so just a few weeks with CellCan to launch the Canadian Advanced Therapy Training Institute to train GMP staff. Because, you know, if you think of all these investments, we're going to need thousands of employees for all these new facilities. And I highlight University of Toronto because they're a key partner, but the University of Toronto has also been conducting workshops and is thinking about training and pilot facilities in manufacturing as well. And just wanted to highlight that working with academia will be really important in this training. Final slide. So, you know, are we trending in the right direction? Here I show a table of, you know, 4 new that we've been a part of since just 2016, just a few years ago. And some of the kind of capabilities on the left. And, you know, in Canada and Ontario, we've always had great research capability, IP infrastructure. But when we launched a company in 2016, we didn't have any domestic investment in that company. Our manufacturing platforms were not in place at all. And 5% of that company is employed in Canada, and it's based in Boston. In 2018, we supported another company creation, and some of our manufacturing platforms were in place at that time. No domestic investment. About 50% of the staff of that company is based in Canada. In 2020, we launched a company. There was domestic investment in that company, and even CCRM invested in that company, and our manufacturing platforms were well in place, although not at the commercial scale or training, and well over 50% of the staff are in Canada. So our expectation is that, you know, 2 years major spinoff, we will be able to catalyze significant domestic investment. More of our manufacturing will be in place, and this combination of manufacturing capability, you know, access to capital and training, access to the, will really drive this model for creating companies in an area that is emerging. I'll stop there and happy to answer questions.
So I'll just do a couple of questions just because we are running a bit long, but because we're so fascinated by this topic. So I think the first question, I think CCRM has done a huge amount to move cell and gene therapy and opportunities in Canada, clearly. But can you speak just a little bit more about what you think more needs to be done, maybe on a more holistic level within Canada around cell and gene therapy for the health and the economic? Obviously, capital is one of them. And maybe that also leads into the second question, which was, you know, how do you, in this ecosystem, how do you see, say, collaborations with Veto or some of these others that are collaborators, but potentially a little bit in competition? I call it co-opetition, so that you all want to work together, but you're all trying to leverage the same money, for example. So do you want to speak a little bit about that, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's not a lot of competition between some of the different therapeutic platforms, or there shouldn't be. We should all be kind of growing together. But, you know, areas like training and being able to, you know, develop a workforce really spans all segments of biomanufacturing, and we should be working together on that with government. So I think that's a no-brainer on the training side. In terms of, you know, pan-Canadian collaboration around cell and gene therapy, you know, there are clinical phase facilities across the country where we could cooperate on best practices, on, you know, SOPs, where we could make certain that no company leaves Canada. So we share our expertise, et cetera. You know, commercial scale manufacturing there isn't commercial scale manufacturing in the sector in Canada, so we need to start that. You know, one of the areas we're going to have to cooperate in the future is not just on technology push and creating companies and technologies and getting them manufactured, but on the adoption side. How do we work with hospitals and the reimbursement agencies to make certain that novel, new, revolutionary therapies like cell and gene therapies are adopted and paid for, and come at a kind of reasonable price to enhance health outcomes in Canada as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael. And I would comment that that's something that LSO is also really very interested in, and we've done a couple of breakfast meetings on that. And I think that absolutely an opportunity maybe to have you back and talk about some of these very novel technologies and adoption, because sometimes it's hard too for the regulator. There's lots of training goes on all ends, right? So sometimes regulators need some training too, because these are new to them, for them to adopt them, or hospitals for adopting them as well. So Michael, thank you very much. If you have more questions, I'm sure Michael will be happy to answer them. Just get a hold of Michael, and or stay, if I don't know if Michael's staying for the networking, but hopefully he can. But CCRM is a real success story, and we can all be proud of what Michael and his team have done.
Thanks, Allison. And I hope everyone will stick around just for a few more minutes. I have a few quick announcements, and then we're going to release you to do some virtual networking on the Remo platform, which is where we started the program. Brian, if you could advance the slide. So our golf tournament is sold out. We are restricted to 100 people, participants at this event, because of the public health guidelines. If they change, we will open up more spots. So there is a waiting list that if you're interested in, get on the waiting list. And there's still sponsorship opportunities available for this event as well. Our awards presentation, many of you may recall we had a networking event back in February when we typically would have our awards. Well, this is the more formal presentation for the awardees. This is going to be a virtual event on October 14th. Registration is open. We are in the process of filming all of our awards. Awardees and their acceptance speeches, and so hopefully you'll join us for that evening to celebrate their contributions. And in September, we have our second time around our LSO road trip. We did this the first time last year. It was a great success. We visited for a week-long session. We basically had a breakfast meeting each of the 5 days in a different location. And this year we're having Kingston, Mississauga, Sudbury's, and others will be announced. And so join us in September for our road trip. And finally, I'd like to thank our sponsors, our platinum sponsors shown here, our gold sponsors, and of course our bronze sponsors, our silver sponsors. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us. We couldn't obviously do these events without the support of all our members and our supporters. So thank you again, and hopefully you'll stick around and do some virtual networking. Have a great day, everyone.